Well, thank you very much. If you'd asked me about me being here talking to you about this 12 months ago and put a few bucks on it, I reckon you've got pretty good odds. It is good to be here, and it's great to be here amongst very good friends. Can I acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues? Great to see you up here from Tassie Guy, someone who I know is also very passionate about the forest industry, and just also want to acknowledge the work of my successor and predecessor in this role, Anne Ruston, and the work of the Forest Industries Advisory Council under the co-stewardship of Rob DeFagley, but also the work of AFPA, who have been continuous and passionate supporters of this industry, and also particularly my department, who, when we set out on this task after the 2013 election, and I went and spent some time with them to tell them what I wanted and why, and then asked the most dangerous question, which was, have I said anything dopey yet? And they said no. I said, okay, now the job is to help us get there. And I've got to say, they just put everything in to develop the process. So thank you to the team in the department, Daryl. They really did put in for us in developing where we're at today, so great work. So going back to September 2017, and I think Ross has specifically chosen the night of the Midwinter Ball, not only to keep people like me out of trouble, but to acknowledge the anniversary of that presentation by the Prime Minister in 2017 to announce the development of the plan, because as we've heard from Greg, we have gone backwards in the context of our plantation estate, and 3 million trees was the 3 million hectares was the target. We got to 2.1 and we're a bit short. So the 2018 budget included $20 million towards the implementation of the plan, and I'll go through how we intend to do that. But I think the important point is the one that Greg made: the right trees in the right place of the right type to grow this industry, and we effectively need 1 billion new trees. So that's the headline. So 400,000 hectares of additional plantation that will be required for the continued growth of this very, very important industry. We see all the frames going up in our cities, but the impacts of this industry spreads right across the country through our regional communities. We know that, those communities know that, and the support of such a strong industry is important in making sure that we achieve that. So through the plan, we'll have 4 key activities. Creating regional forestry hubs. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to be all that difficult, but it's recognising those areas around this country where we do grow trees, where we do have strong forestry sectors, and where we do have good community support for the planting of trees and the growth of the trees, because those communities actually understand how important it is to their communities. We'll be reducing the barriers to forestry expansion, and I'll go through that a little bit in a moment. Using our forest resources smarter, and of course we need to continue to work with our communities on growing their community, the community understanding of forestry. So we need to keep talking to our communities about the importance of the industry, but also making the connection with the things out of our industry that they love. Now, whether it's their house frame, whether it's the really schmick new CLT high-rise buildings that are starting to appear in Australian cities, or whether it's that magnificent dining table made from red gum or Jarrah or one of those great iconic Australian timbers, or it's the new allergy-free floor in their house, we need to make the connection between the source of the product and their end use, so that they actually value that. And we need to convince them, and continue to convince them, that what we're doing is sustainable, it's well managed, and it's managed in the best interests of all of the values that they support. Going back to plantations. So today, privately owned plantations produce most of Australia's. Sorry, reverting to tiger. Got the Tassie tiger on. Most of Australia's timber and wood fibre. As Greg said, we've got nearly 2 million hectares of timber plantations that produce 87% of Australia's log harvest. However, there's effectively been no plantation expansion since the collapse of MIS in the early 2000s. So the estate's gone backwards. The plantation sector tell us that that investment hurdles are too high at the moment and for plantation expansion, but we're not proposing subsidies. They've identified 2 specific factors for further work. Participation of plantations in the Emissions Reduction Fund. We all know that if we're going to deal with carbon reduction, landscape scale is one of the best ways to do it, and the most effective way to do it is by incorporating that carbon into trees. And also looking at the foreign investment review process. So that we want to be a facilitator, we don't want to be in the way of the process, and so we need to try and find ways, or identify the ways, the things that are inhibiting the growth of the industry, and see what we can do to manage those. So for example, the negative list on the ERF and the Emissions Reduction Fund excludes any plantation investment from participating in areas above a 600mm annual rainfall without adequately accounting for water interception and use. So we'll review that 600mm limitation, which I think is going to be very important.
Yeah, great.
If I was a cynic, and possibly I could be accused of that when it comes to talking to the Greens, in my view that was put in place specifically to stop the planting of trees. And so I think it's reasonable that it's reviewed, and we find a mechanism to make sure that we don't have those inhibitors in place to actually do that. And as I said, we will go through some review of the Foreign Investment Review Board processes so that we can see if we can facilitate additional investment to grow the sector. So in that context, effectively all plantation expansion currently requires land parcel by parcel approval through the Foreign Investment Review Board. And yet most forestry investment is by large multinational timber investment management organisations. So you're telling us that this is an extremely lengthy and onerous process, and therefore missing out on land purchases due to the time delays. So we will suggest, you've suggested to us streamlining the FIRB process, or a pre-approval to a certain dollar area or area limit with appropriate conditions. So we think that that might actually facilitate further investment into the industry and be one of the factors in growing the plantation estate. And also through implementation of some of the broader actions set out and identified in the plan. We are about trying to grow the forest sector and therefore grow the supply of timber, because if you go back to, I think where we might have been in 2014, we talked about the global demand for timber growth. I think the number then was the same as it is now, which is a quadrupling of that demand for timber by 2050. And if you think about the life cycles of this industry, and I remember at one of the FIRE meetings, Rob, when we brought a facilitator in to talk about drawing us through the process of developing the initial document, she said to me, "Why are we talking 2050?" And I said, "Put a pine tree in the ground today and harvest it in 35 years." This was 2015. We're at 2050. So that was the end of that conversation. But because she quickly understood the time cycles that we're talking about in the developing of the supply of product for this industry. And that's part of the thought process we have to be dealing with. Now, there are some shorter rotation options, obviously, but when we're talking about growing the supply, we need to be thinking, and we need to get the community thinking in the context of life cycles of the industry. We will continue to our process around the management of native forests. So in 2013, when we came to government, we committed to a 20-year rolling RFA. We commenced that process. Tasmania signed off. We're still talking to other states, and we will continue that process. One of the tragedies, Greg, about the RFA process is that once we did the assessments, once we did the work, governments couldn't just leave it alone. Couldn't just leave it alone. I remember being quizzed by a member of the media about 3 or 4 years ago, asking about RFAs and why they hadn't provided the supply security that they were designed to, and it was simply because we just didn't leave them alone. Had we left them alone, we would be in a much better position in the context of our native forest estate today. So we'll continue that process. We'll be undertaking an inventory of forest resources, importantly on private land, because I think they can provide a very important part of the supply into that native species market. So we'll be working with state and willing private forest owners to unlock that potential timber supply, and I think there's some really good work that we can do around generating some collaboration in that space. I think that's important. And also have had some conversations in the past, and we will now start working with interested Indigenous communities to identify the potential for commercial timber operations on their lands. In my mind, one of the best ways that we can generate some activity, employment in Indigenous communities while allowing them to work on their country, managing their country, is via the forest industry. There are some inhibitors that we've got to take out of the way, particularly in the context of talking to some of the state governments, but I think it's important that we actually do that, and with some of the species that they have access to on their lands, we are talking significantly high value products that can be generated, and so it can be managed at low impact, high value returns to those communities, and I think it's one of the things that we can work with those communities to actually transform the relationship that they have, or return the relationship that they have with their country as a part of developing the resource that they have available to them. So I'll just go through some of the actions around the creation of the forestry hubs. The concept's been around for a period of time. It was part of the initial discussions that we had in the early days of the FIAC. But we will be working closely with state governments. I'm happy to receive representations from industry and of course my colleagues around the identification of the hubs. But most of you know where they are, because that's where you work and you understand what's involved with them. But importantly, we want to start also working with the rural sector, and I've had conversations with the NFF today about how we can start to work more closely with the agricultural sector, with farmers, to put some trees back onto their land, which can improve some of their values, and we've seen it in being done already in some parts of the country. So where it's appropriate, right trees, right species, right places, and utilising the tools that we currently have, carbon farming initiative, a return from the trees, improvements in their farm values and their management programs around particularly their animals, there is a real opportunity when you bundle those things together to create the level of incentive that's required to make it worthwhile for them to make those decisions. And then the opportunity for us to start to get out of, over time, out of those areas, a viable timber resource when it's collated into its volume. And I've had some conversations only in the last few weeks, in fact before coming back into this portfolio, with some farm foresters in Tasmania who are very keen to get back into that space because it hasn't been viable, or it hasn't been seen to be viable for them. And so I know that there is a real desire and a willingness for farmers to engage in that space, and that was confirmed to me by the NFF today. I've already mentioned what we're going to do around the reducing barriers to expansion with work around the emissions reduction fund, and also the FIRB. But we do have to start using our resources smarter. And so we've developed or announced to National Institute for Forest Products Innovation. This plan provides for a further 2 locations, which I think is important. And I can expect my colleagues to be all over me saying we would like one of those. So we'll be establishing a national steering committee to oversee the new centres, providing national coordination and guidance, enabling the nodes to move towards specialisations in priority areas for industry such as bioproducts, hardwood, softwood plantation, and of course, importantly, social licence. We will be working closely with Forest and Wood Products Australia to support the ongoing research and development extension activities associated with the industry. And also, we want to support forestry education at a secondary and tertiary level. There are a few people who I know well in this room who think very fondly of their days in the forestry education sector, don't they, Peter? And we've talked about it many a time, but it is very important. It is very important. And so we want to support forestry education and secondary and tertiary levels, because it is important that we have the people, the skilled people, to actually manage and undertake this growth. We obviously want to continue to work with our communities around community understanding, and we have some processes in place that already do that. And we need to continue to do that on a consistent basis, because those who don't like us and don't want us will continue to oppose us. And so we need to keep telling our story, and we need to keep telling our story consistently and actively and persistently, because they won't stop. So we have to continue with that process as well. So 1 billion new trees, 400,000 hectares, the right trees, the right species in the right place. Your language perfectly, Greg. It is really important that we get this right, because I think I might have said in 2014 what we're looking at in the context of existing uses won't be the same over time. I was fortunate enough to visit the test bed for the Cyrene product that's being done at Norski in the Derwent Valley. So not only will we be utilising timber for the existing uses that we've had for a long period of time, we will be looking to replace other products with timber-based products. So Cyrene, looking at changing over from petrochemicals. I think you've heard me talk a number of times about nanocrystalline cellulose. And I got better at saying it and haven't forgot it. But of course, innovations like CLT, where I think I started talking about in my last incarnation as timber being the building material of the 21st century, and every month that goes on you see more and more examples of that being the case. And in the context of a carbon constrained world, why wouldn't you? So, you know, we're getting to the stage where I think we've got a product that not only can we be proud of, we can boast about. We can then start making the connections of that back to our broader communities. And it's now up to us together to start working towards the development of and the continued growth of this industry so that we can meet the supply demands that we see coming down the track with that quadrupling of global demand for timber products by 2050. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It is an absolute delight to be here at this stage of the process, and I look forward to working with you all for the implementation of the plan.